They almost dragged her off the jet bridge. The security officer's hand clamped around her elbow, fingers digging into bone, his voice low and sharp as broken glass. "Ma'am, step away, now." The terminal noise fell away in a blink. Conversations stalled. Shoes stopped mid-step. Somewhere behind them, a child began to cry, the sound thin and nervous. She did not resist. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her eyes. Calm, focused, unafraid. The kind of eyes that had seen worse than embarrassment, worse than force. Around them, the glass corridor leading to gate C-17 glowed under fluorescent lights. Beyond it sat the aircraft, sleek, white, new enough to still smell like fresh composite and factory sealant. The most advanced commercial jet ever certified on American soil, according to the banners hanging above the concourse. Reporters clustered near the windows. Executives in tailored suits smiled for cameras. Everything about the scene screamed celebration, and she did not belong in any of it. At least, that's what everyone believed. Margaret Hale stood barely over 5'4" shoulders. Slightly stooped gray hair pulled back into a tight knot that hadn't changed in years. Her jacket was plain, navy blue, faded at the elbows. No logo, no badge clipped to the lapel. Just a canvas tote hanging from her shoulder, heavy enough to pull the strap into her coat. To the people watching, she looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn. A cleaner, a contractor, a nobody who wandered too close to something important. The security officer tightened his grip. "You don't have clearance to be here." "We've been patient." His eyes flicked toward the growing audience. Last warning. Margaret glanced past him toward the cockpit windows. Her breath slowed. In her head, numbers moved. Timelines. Thresholds. She had been counting them since the moment the auxiliary systems powered up. 6 minutes. X. Behind the officer, a man in a charcoal suit leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "Unbelievable." On a day like this. His companion smirked. Someone else laughed under their breath. Margaret heard all of it. She always did. She let her eyes drop to the officer's wrist, to the digital watch, blinking red as it synced with airport systems. She spoke quietly. Not to him, not to anyone. Just enough for the words to exist. "If you delay me another minute, you're going to own what happens next." The officer scoffed. "That's enough." He started to pull. And then the sound came. A low tone. Barely audible at first. A vibration more than a noise. It rolled through the jet bridge floor, subtle but wrong, like a bass note out of tune. Margaret's head snapped up. Her jaw tightened. Inside the cockpit, a light flickered. Just once. Green to amber. Back to green. No one else noticed. She did. The officer paused, distracted by the sudden crackle in his earpiece. A voice spilled through, tense and rushed. "Hold! Stand by!" He frowned. "What stand by? Don't move her." Margaret exhaled through her nose, slow, controlled. The jet bridge doors slid shut behind them, with a hydraulic hiss sealing the corridor. Outside, cameras kept flashing, unaware that the mood had shifted by a degree so small it could only be felt by people who knew how systems failed. Not loudly, not all at once, but politely, quietly, until they didn't. This had never been about being seen. It had started hours earlier, long before hands grabbed arms and voices rose. That morning, Margaret arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth. Before sunrise, the sky still a dull slate gray. She moved through Terminal C with the ease of routine shoes whispering against polished tile. People brushed past her without looking. Suits, lanyards, coffee cups steaming in tired hands. At the security checkpoint, she presented her temporary access card. The TSA agent barely glanced at it before waving her through. Low-level technical clearance. Nothing special. The kind of pass that opened doors no one thought about. She preferred it that way. Near the maintenance corridor, 2 junior engineers stood arguing over a tablet. One of them, barely 30 hair, still perfect at 6 in the morning, jabbed at the screen. "I'm telling you, the integration passed. We ran the checks twice." The other shook his head. "It shouldn't be drawing that much power during idle. That's not our system." "Everything's our system today." Margaret slowed as she passed eyes drifting to the tablet. A schematic flashed for half a second. She stopped walking. Neither man noticed her until she spoke. That node shouldn't be active before climb. They both turned startled. The first engineer blinked. "Excuse me?" She pointed one finger steady. "That's subsystem. You're reading baseline numbers. You're not looking at transition load." The second engineer squinted. "Who are you?" "Someone who's seen this fail before." The first man snorted. "Ma'am, this is restricted. We've got it covered." Margaret studied his face. Young, confident, untouched by consequence. She nodded once and moved on. She didn't argue. She never did. Arguing wasted time. Instead, she followed the data. In a side operations room, half forgotten behind a row of vending machines, Margaret set her tote down and powered up an old diagnostic terminal. The screen glowed pale blue, humming softly. Her fingers moved without hesitation, muscle memory guiding them through layers of access that no one bothered to lock anymore. Lines of code scrolled. Parameters shifted. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass eyes, sharp, despite the lines etched deep around them. There it was. Not a virus. Not sabotage. Worse. A legacy control routine left behind from a testing phase, dormant, but wired into the autopilot's adaptive layer. It wasn't supposed to wake until high-altitude cruise, but someone had pushed the activation window forward, by minutes, by exactly 6. Margaret closed her eyes. She'd seen this once before, years ago. A different aircraft, a different city, a hearing room packed with suits who swore it couldn't happen again. It always did. She gathered her things and headed for the gate. By the time she reached the jet bridge, the celebration was in full swing. The chief pilot laughed with a reporter. A vice president from the manufacturer shook hands with a senator. The air buzzed with pride and money and certainty. Margaret stepped forward, raising her hand slightly. "I need to speak with whoever signed off on the final integration." A flight attendant turned smile already tight. "Ma'am, passengers only beyond this point." "I'm not a passenger, that's clear." A manager appeared, eyes flicking over Margaret's clothes. "You're going to have to leave. I don't have time." That was when security got involved. And now here they stood, 6 minutes, collapsing into seconds. In the sealed jet bridge, the officer's radio crackled again. A different voice this time, older, steadier. "What's her name?" The officer hesitated. "I don't know." "She won't say." A pause, then quieter. "Does she have a tote bag?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Let her go." The officer's grip loosened. Margaret straightened her jacket, smoothing the fabric once. She stepped forward past him toward the aircraft. Behind her, someone finally asked the question out loud. "Who is that woman?" Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. In her mind, the countdown continued. And somewhere deep inside, the most advanced jet ever built, a system waited to be told what to do next. The jet bridge vibrated again, stronger this time, a tremor that crawled up through the soles of Margaret Hale's shoes and into her knees. She stopped halfway down the corridor, one hand brushing the cool aluminum wall eyes, lifting to the ceiling as if she could hear the aircraft breathing. Inside the cockpit, a warning chime sounded. Not loud, not urgent, the kind designed to be ignored. Captain Daniel Reeves frowned at the panel, his fingers hovering. He was 61 silver hair, trimmed close posture, rigid from decades of habit. He had flown through ice storms and hydraulic failures, and one night over the Atlantic he never spoke about. This chime was nothing, or so it wanted him to believe. He glanced at his first officer, a woman half his age, sharp-eyed, already leaning forward. "You see that?" she asked quietly. "I see it," Reeves said. "I don't like it." On the jet bridge, Margaret felt the shift. Systems didn't scream at first. They whispered. She turned back toward the security officer who had grabbed her minutes earlier. His name tag read Mark Delaney, mid-40s, former military by the way he stood. He looked unsettled now, radio pressed tight to his ear. "They're asking questions," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "About you." Margaret nodded once. "Good." Delaney swallowed. "They want you in operations." "I know." He stepped aside, clearing the path. As she moved past him, a young man in a tailored suit blocked her way, face flushed. He had the confident smile of someone used to being obeyed. "Hold on. You can't just walk in there. This is a controlled environment." Margaret stopped inches from him. She studied his face, the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth, the sheen of sweat at his hairline. He smelled like expensive cologne and nerves. "If you're responsible for software integration, you should already be running contingency checks," she said. "If you're not, get out of my way." The man bristled. "And who exactly are you?" Margaret leaned closer, voice dropping. "Someone who has already seen how this ends." For a moment, he looked like he might argue. Then another vibration rolled through the bridge, sharper, accompanied by a muted thump from the aircraft belly. His bravado cracked. He stepped aside. Operations smelled like old coffee and overheated electronics. Screens lined the walls, each pulsing with streams of data. Conversations overlapped in tight, controlled bursts. When Margaret entered the room, faltered. Heads turned. A murmur rippled. A woman in her late 50s stood at the central console, glasses perched low on her nose. Linda Carver, Director of Flight Readiness. She had been awake since 3 a.m, and it showed in the tight set of her jaw. Who let her in? Margaret met her gaze. The system did. Carver stared. "I don't have time for your adaptive control layer is pulling authority from the primary flight computer during pre-climb," Margaret said. "It shouldn't." Silence fell. Carver's hand froze mid-gesture. "That's impossible. It's happening." Carver turned sharply to a technician. "Pull the transition logs." Fingers flew. A screen shifted. Lines of data scrolled faster. The technician's face drained of color. "Ma'am, she's right." The room tightened. Someone cursed under their breath. Carver looked back at Margaret. Really looked this time. "Explain." Margaret set her tote on the floor, opening it with practiced calm. Inside were printed schematics, annotated in neat, compact handwriting. She spread them across the console. During testing, a fallback routine was embedded to smooth handoffs between manual and automated control. It was never fully removed. Someone advanced its trigger condition. Carver's voice dropped. "Who, that's a later question." Another chime echoed from the cockpit, louder now. Captain Reeves's voice cut through the speakers, controlled but edged. "Ops were seeing inconsistent authority flags. Advise." Carver pressed the mic. "Stand by, Captain." Margaret leaned in. "Do not let it climb." Carver hesitated. A lifetime of protocol warred with instinct. "We don't ground aircraft on hypotheticals." Margaret's eyes hardened. "This is not a hypothetical. If that routine asserts itself at altitude, your crew will fight a machine that thinks it knows better, and it will win." The room held its breath. Carver closed her eyes for half a second. Then she keyed the mic. Captain Reeves, delay taxi. Hold position. On the jet bridge, applause from the terminal died mid-cheer as the aircraft engines powered down. Confusion spread like heat. Reporters checked their phones. A vice president frowned. Inside the cockpit, Reeves exhaled slowly. Copy. Back in operations, tension surged. Phones rang. A man in a dark suit entered briskly, badge swinging. Thomas Keller. Legal. He took in the scene, eyes narrowing. "What's going on?" Carver answered without looking at him. "We have a systems anomaly." Keller's gaze landed on Margaret. "And who is she?" Margaret straightened. "The reason your insurance premiums exist," Keller scoffed. "This delay is costing Margaret cut him off. Lives are not line items." Keller opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked to Carver. "Is she authorized?" Carver hesitated. Then quietly, "She should be." Keller studied Margaret again, something shifting behind his eyes. Recognition faint but growing. "Hale?" he said slowly. "Margaret Hale." Margaret met his stare. "Hello, Tom." The room went still. Keller's face drained. "You retired." I consulted. "You were at the Mitchell inquiry," he said. "The North Carolina incident." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I warned them too." Carver's voice was low. "Why wasn't I informed you were here?" Margaret answered honestly. "Because I wasn't supposed to be." Outside, the terminal buzzed with speculation. Passengers shifted in their seats. A flight attendant whispered urgently into a phone, eyes darting. In operations, the data shifted again. A warning indicator flashed red. The technician swallowed. "The fallback routine is trying to assert. We're seeing partial engagement." Carver's heart pounded. "Can we isolate it?" Margaret's fingers moved across the console, steady, despite the rising chaos. "You can slow it. But you can't kill it from here." Reeves' voice crackled through again. "Ops, I'm getting resistance on manual input." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then leaned into the mic. "Captain, listen to me. Reduce thrust. Do not attempt override." Reeves stiffened. "And you are someone who wants you alive." A beat. Then Reeves nodded once unseen. "Copy." The aircraft shuddered as power dropped. Alarms chimed. The terminal erupted in confusion. Carver watched the data stabilize barely. How long? Margaret checked the clock on the wall. "We bought ourselves time. Not much." Keller rubbed his temples. "This will be a nightmare." Margaret looked at him, her voice quiet but cutting. "It already was. You just didn't know." The screens flickered again. The jet sat heavy and silent, held in a fragile balance between human hands and lines of code that had learned long ago how to be stubborn. And beneath the noise, beneath the fear, Margaret felt the old certainty settle in her chest. The moment before truth surfaced. The moment when everyone in the room would have to decide whether they listened now or paid for it later. The silence that followed was heavier than any alarm. Inside operations, no one spoke. Screens glowed. Fans hummed. Somewhere deep in the terminal, a public announcement crackled and cut out mid-sentence, replaced by an uneasy murmur that rolled like weather through the concourse. Margaret Hale stood with both hands braced on the console, eyes fixed on the cascading data, feeling the machine hesitate. Not fail, hesitate, as if weighing its options. Captain Daniel Reeves felt it too. In the cockpit, his knuckles were white around the yoke. The aircraft was still. Too still. Modern jets were never truly quiet. There was always feedback, always resistance. This felt like a held breath. His first officer glanced at him, her jaw tight. "She's fighting us," she said. Not panicked. Not yet. Just stating a fact. Reeves nodded once. "She thinks she's right." Back in operations, Linda Carver broke the silence. If we shut the adaptive layer completely, we violate certification protocol. Margaret didn't look away from the screen. If you don't, you violate physics. Carver swallowed. That routine was designed to prevent human error. Margaret finally turned. Her eyes were sharp, reflective, carrying the weight of decades. So was every system that ever killed someone. A young engineer shifted in his chair, hands trembling. Ma'am, the routine is escalating its authority window. It's not supposed to do that. Margaret leaned closer, scanning the code. It's compensating. Someone taught it to. Thomas Keller cleared his throat. We need to consider exposure. If this becomes public, Margaret cut him off without raising her voice. Tom, if this goes airborne, exposure will be the least of your concerns. Keller stiffened but said nothing. He knew that tone. He'd heard it years ago in a windowless room in Washington, when Margaret Hale dismantled an entire safety board with nothing but data and calm inevitability. On the jet bridge, Mark Delaney stood frozen, watching the aircraft through the glass. The celebration banners drooped overhead, mocking now. He replayed the moment he grabbed her arm. The certainty in her eyes, the lack of fear. He'd mistaken it for defiance. Now he recognized it for what it was. Knowledge. A supervisor rushed past him, phone pressed to her ear. No, I don't know why. Yes, I understand the optics. She glanced back at the aircraft voice dropping. No, sir. It's not moving. Inside operations. The technician spoke again, voice barely steady. The routine is attempting a handshake with the flight management system. If it completes, it will lock priority. Margaret finished, and you won't get it back. Carver's shoulders sagged. How do we stop it? Margaret straightened slowly. This was the moment she'd been circling since dawn, the one she'd hoped not to reach. You don't stop it from here, she said. You stop it from the air. Reeves's voice came through the speakers tight now. Ops, we're losing fine control. Advise. Margaret stepped to the mic. Captain Reeves, I need you to do something that will make every procedure manual scream. Reeves didn't hesitate. Say it. You're going to force a partial reboot of the adaptive layer by creating a conflict it cannot resolve. The first officer's head snapped toward the speaker. That's insane. Margaret's voice remained steady. It's uncomfortable. There's a difference. Reeves closed his eyes briefly, the way he did before committing to a hard choice. He remembered storms, ice, fire. He remembered trusting his hands when the world told him not to. Tell me how. Margaret spoke quickly now, rhythm accelerating. Reduce thrust further. Introduce asymmetric input. Not enough to trigger alarms. Enough to confuse the routine's prediction model. Carver's breath caught. That could destabilize it will, Margaret said. For seconds. Then the routine will cede authority back to you. The room held its breath. Reeves exchanged a look with his first officer. She nodded fear and trust, warring in her eyes. I'm with you. He adjusted the controls. The aircraft shuddered. A low groan rolled through the fuselage, felt more than heard. In the terminal, passengers gasped. Phones came up. Somewhere, someone started praying. On the operations screens, lines of data spiked. Red flashed, yellow, red again. Authority conflict detected, the technician whispered. Margaret's heart hammered, but her face remained carved from stone. Come on, she murmured, not to the people, but to the machine. Choose. Inside the cockpit, alarms chirped sharp and insistent. Reeves held steady muscles, screaming. The aircraft lurched, then stilled. The resistance vanished. Control flowed back into his hands like a familiar weight. He exhaled. Ops. Manual authority restored. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Technicians shouted confirmations. Carver sagged against the console hands, shaking. Keller sank into a chair, pale. The data stabilized the dangerous routine, collapsing in on itself, isolated and inert. Margaret closed her eyes just for a second. Then she opened them and straightened the moment already passing. In the terminal, an announcement finally came, measured and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. The flight will remain at the gate, pending a technical review." There was no applause this time, just relief, confusion, and questions. Mark Delaney felt his knees weaken. He leaned against the glass, staring at the aircraft that had almost become a headline. He thought of his kids, of the hand he'd put on that woman's arm. Shame burned hot and unexpected. In operations, Carver turned to Margaret. Her voice was hoarse. "You saved that aircraft." Margaret met her gaze. "We did. Because you listened." Keller stood slowly, straightening his jacket out of habit. "This will trigger an investigation." Margaret nodded. "It should." He hesitated. "They'll ask why someone like you was here without formal notice." Margaret picked up her tote. "Tell them the truth. That systems don't fail because of arrogance alone. They fail because people stop listening to the quiet warnings." Carver swallowed. "Who are you?" Margaret paused at the doorway, the noise of the terminal swelling behind her. She turned eyes, sweeping the room. "I'm someone who spent her life being ignored until it was inconvenient not to." She stepped out into the concourse. Cameras swung toward her immediately. Microphones followed. Voices called out questions. She walked through them, without stopping shoulders, squared, disappearing into the crowd as if she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. Behind her, the most advanced jet ever built sat grounded safe, humbled by a woman everyone had mistaken for invisible. And in the days that followed, when reports were written, and statements parsed, and blame cautiously assigned, one truth would remain heavy and undeniable. The machine had not saved them. A person had. And no one who had been in that room would ever forget how close they came to learning that lesson the hard way. The room where they gathered her had no windows. It never did. Margaret Hale recognized the space, the moment the door closed behind her, the muted thump sealing out the noise of the terminal. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A long laminate table sat in the center, already crowded with folders, legal pads, untouched bottles of water. This was not a place for gratitude. This was where institutions protected themselves. Thomas Keller took the chair across from her jacket, off now sleeves rolled to the elbow. His confidence had not returned. It wouldn't. Not yet. Linda Carver stood near the wall, arms folded tight across her chest, eyes still red from adrenaline and something closer to fear. Two men Margaret did not recognize sat beside Keller. Government posture, federal restraint. The kind of men who rarely spoke first. One of them finally did. "Ms. Hale," he said calmly, fingers steepled. "For the record, we need you to state why you were present at the airport this morning." Margaret set her tote on the floor, folding her hands on the table. Her voice was even. "Because I was asked to be." Keller glanced up sharply. "By whom?" Margaret met his eyes. "That depends on how honest you want this room to be." Silence pressed in. The second man shifted, clearing his throat. "Let's try again. Were you operating under an active federal contract today?" Margaret nodded once. "Yes." Carver's head snapped up. "Then why wasn't my office notified?" "Because your office was not the subject of the review," Margaret said. The words landed with a quiet violence. Keller leaned forward. "You're telling me this was an audit?" "I'm telling you." Margaret replied that the technology was only half the evaluation. The first man exhaled slowly. "Go on." Margaret's gaze drifted to the table, to the scattered papers that now meant something different than they had that morning. Over the past 3 years, Automated flight control incidents have increased. Not crashes, not even close calls, moments, hesitations, authority conflicts that resolve themselves before anyone has to explain them. Carver swallowed. We document those. You archive them, Margaret said gently. And then you move on. Keller bristled. We follow protocol. Margaret's eyes hardened. Protocol did not catch what nearly happened today. A person did. And that person was dismissed 3 separate times before being listened to. The second man scribbled a note. You allowed the aircraft to reach that state. Margaret shook her head. No, I warned your system would. Carver's voice cracked. You could have escalated. I did, Margaret said, quietly, repeatedly, through channels that assumed the person speaking mattered. Another silence. Heavier now. Keller leaned back, running a hand over his face. So what was this really about? Margaret looked up, meeting every gaze in the room. It was about whether your organization still recognizes expertise when it doesn't arrive wrapped in authority. No one spoke. Outside the room, the airport buzzed with rumor. News alerts flickered across screens. A delayed flight. A technical review. No details. Not yet. In the terminal, Mark Delaney stood near a column, watching reporters swarm a spokesperson who said nothing of substance. His jaw clenched. He replayed the moment again. Her voice, calm, certain. He wondered how many times in his career he had moved someone like her out of the way. Inside the room, the first man closed his folder. You put a lot of people at risk. Margaret nodded. So did the routine. The difference is intent. Carver stepped forward. If we had not listened. But you did, Margaret said. Eventually. Keller's voice was quiet now. You embarrassed us. Margaret considered him. No, you were exposed. There's a difference. The second man looked up from his notes. Do you intend to file a formal report? Margaret nodded. Already drafted. And testify if required. Yes. Keller let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You always were thorough. Margaret allowed herself a small, tired smile. That's why people stopped inviting me to meetings. The door opened briefly. A woman in a communications badge leaned in, face tight. We need guidance. Press is pushing harder. They're hearing whispers about federal involvement. Keller closed his eyes. Of course they are. Margaret stood. You should tell them the truth. Every head turned. Carver shook her head. We can't. Margaret picked up her tote. Then you'll lie, and the lie will cost you later. The first man studied her. What do you want? Margaret paused. This was the part people always misunderstood. Nothing. Keller frowned. That's not how this works. It is for me, Margaret said. I did not come here for credit. I came to prevent a failure. Carver's voice was barely above a whisper. You saved us. Margaret looked at her. Really looked. The exhaustion, the responsibility, the fear of being the last link in a chain that snapped. No, she said softly. You saved yourselves. The moment you chose to listen. She turned toward the door. Keller stood abruptly. Wait. Margaret stopped. He hesitated, then spoke. They're going to want to make you the story. Margaret's shoulders sagged just slightly. They always do. You could use that, he said. Push reform. Get a seat. Margaret glanced back, eyes sharp but weary. I had seats. I lost them by saying things people didn't want to hear. She opened the door. The noise hit her like a wave. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted her name, though most of them had learned it only minutes earlier. A reporter lunged forward. Miss Hale, were you involved in grounding the aircraft? Margaret didn't break stride. She moved through them, a steady line through chaos. Mark Delaney saw her emerge and felt something twist in his chest. He stepped forward, hesitated, then spoke. "Ma'am?" Margaret stopped. "I'm sorry," he said the words raw. "For earlier." Margaret studied him. His eyes were wet. Honest. "Apology accepted," she said. "Learn from it." He nodded throat tight. She walked on. Behind her, the system she had challenged began to turn on itself. Committees formed. Language softened. Responsibility blurred. But something fundamental had shifted. Not enough. Never enough. But enough for today. Margaret exited through a side door, the afternoon light sharp against her eyes. She paused, breathing in the scent of jet fuel and hot pavement. The aircraft sat still at the gate, humbled metal under a wide Texas sky. She did not look back, because she knew what came next. The machines would be fixed, the reports would be filed, the speeches would be written, and somewhere someone would remember a woman they had mistaken for invisible and hesitate, and that Margaret knew was how real change began. The official statement came out just after sunset. Margaret Hale was already gone. By the time the press finished reading the carefully sanded language on their phones, by the time analysts began parsing what was said and what was not, she was sitting in the driver's seat of a rental sedan on the far side of the airport, hands resting on the steering wheel engine, off watching planes lift into the darkening sky one by one. Each takeoff carved a thin white line through the clouds, brief, decisive, irreversible. Inside the terminal, Thomas Keller stood at a podium under harsh lights, his tie perfectly straight, his voice steady enough to sound practiced. He spoke of an abundance of caution, of a temporary systems review, of collaboration between industry partners and federal advisors. He did not say her name, not once. He did not need to. The reporters knew there was a missing piece, and missing pieces always made better stories. Linda Carver watched from the edge of the crowd, arms folded, jaw clenched. Every sentence Keller delivered scraped against her nerves. She could feel the truth pressing behind her ribs, demanding air. She caught her reflection in the glass wall behind the cameras and barely recognized herself. She looked older. Not from the day's stress, but from the realization that she had almost ignored the only voice that mattered. In the rental car, Margaret adjusted the rearview mirror, studying her own face. The lines were deeper than she remembered. Her eyes were tired, not broken, just tired. She had spent a lifetime being called in when things went wrong, and a lifetime being dismissed when she tried to prevent them from going wrong at all. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it at first. The silence felt earned. Eventually she glanced down. 3 missed calls, 2 texts. One from an unknown number. One from Linda Carver. "Please call me. We need to talk." Margaret sighed and slipped the phone back into her bag. She turned the key. The engine came to life, a low, reassuring hum. As she pulled out of the parking lot, a final cheer erupted from the terminal. Behind her, some delayed announcement, some manufactured relief. She didn't turn around. The drive away from the airport was long and flat highway lights, stretching endlessly ahead. Margaret drove with the radio off, letting her thoughts settle. She replayed the moment in operations when the routine collapsed, the hesitation, the choice. She knew how close they had come, closer than anyone would ever admit publicly. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. Margaret Linda said immediately, voice tight, rushed, "Where are you?" Leaving, Margaret replied, "You can't just disappear." "I already have." A pause, then softer. "They're asking for you." Margaret smiled faintly. "Of course they are. They want you in Washington. Testimony, advisory role. They're talking about forming a task force." Margaret kept her eyes on the road. "Good. Good," Linda echoed. "You're the reason they're doing it." "That's not true," Margaret said. "They're doing it because they were scared." Linda exhaled shakily. "I should have listened sooner." Margaret's voice gentled. You listened when it mattered. That doesn't feel like enough. It never does. Another silence, heavy but honest. Will you come back? Linda asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched a semi-truck pass her, its lights blazing unstoppable in its momentum. Not for that, she said, finally. Then for what? Margaret thought of the young engineer, whose hands had trembled over the keyboard, of Mark Delaney's apology, of the machine waiting patiently to be trusted again. For the people who don't get podiums, she said. For the ones who notice something wrong and are told it isn't their place. Linda swallowed. They need you. Margaret shook her head. They need to learn, without me standing in the room. She ended the call before Linda could argue. Miles away in a quiet hotel room overlooking the runway, Captain Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of his bed, uniform jacket draped over a chair. His hands were still shaking. He stared at them, flexed his fingers, then laughed, once short and sharp. He had trusted a voice he had never seen. He had followed instructions that defied his training manuals. And it had saved his aircraft. He reached for his phone and typed a message he wasn't sure would ever reach its destination. Whoever you are. Thank you. Margaret's phone buzzed again as she merged onto the interstate. She glanced at the message lips, pressing into a thin line. She didn't respond. Gratitude, she had learned, often arrived too late to matter. But this one lingered. At the airport, the tone shifted. Reporters began asking sharper questions. Not about the delay, but about oversight, about redundancy, about why a single individual had identified an issue that layers of automated checks had not. Keller deflected. Carver answered what she could. Somewhere in the exchange, someone used the word janitor, and the room went uncomfortably quiet. Mark Delaney watched from the back, arms crossed. He thought of his father, a machinist who used to come home with grease under his nails and solutions no one had asked for. He wondered how many times he'd dismissed someone who didn't look important. Later that night, as the airport settled into its nocturnal rhythm, an internal email circulated quietly among senior staff. Subject line, Interim Review Findings. Attached a draft report with annotations in a familiar, precise handwriting, no author listed, no signature. The recommendations were unflinching. Protocol changes, authority escalation paths, mandatory cross-level review when anomalies were reported regardless of source. It read less like a document and more like a mirror. By the time Keller finished reading it, his hands were sweating. On the highway, Margaret exited toward a smaller road, one that led away from cities and conference rooms. She passed dark fields and quiet service stations. The world felt larger out here. Less managed, more honest. She pulled into a rest stop and shut off the engine. For a moment, she just sat, listening to the tick of cooling metal. She thought of all the times she had stayed too long fighting battles that weren't hers anymore. She thought of the young woman she had once been standing in rooms like the one at the airport, convinced that if she explained herself clearly enough, someone would listen. She knew better now. Margaret stepped out of the car and stretched joints stiff but reliable. Overhead, the sky was wide and clear stars scattered without pattern or permission. Somewhere far behind her, the most advanced jet in the world sat grounded, waiting for permission to trust itself again. She didn't need to see it to know it was safe. As she got back into the car, her phone buzzed one last time. A news alert preview flashed briefly on the screen before she silenced it. Federal review expands after near incident at Dallas-Fort Worth. Margaret smiled to herself, small and tired and real. She turned the key, pulled back onto the road, and drove into the dark, leaving behind an industry that would spend years pretending this day had been planned. She knew the truth. Change never announced itself. It arrived quietly, carried by someone everyone thought they could ignore. The hearing room smelled like old carpet and polished wood, the kind of place where voices echoed longer than people wanted them to. Margaret Hale sat at the far end of the witness table, hands folded back, straight eyes forward. She wore the same navy jacket, pressed now, sleeves still worn at the elbows. No pin, no insignia, just her. Across from her rows of faces watched senators, advisors, airline executives who had slept maybe 2 hours since the incident. A few journalists lined the back wall notebooks, open pens hovering. The room buzzed with the restrained tension of people who knew the story had already escaped them. The chair of the committee cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, for the record, please state your name and prior role." Margaret leaned toward the microphone. Her voice carried without effort. "Margaret Elaine Hale, former senior systems safety analyst, consultant." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone whispered her name, recognizing it now, attaching it to papers they'd skimmed too late. The chair nodded. "You were present at Dallas-Fort Worth on the day of the incident." "Yes." "And you identified a critical systems failure before it escalated." "I identified a risk," Margaret said calmly. "Others chose to act on it." A man to the chair's right leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Let's be clear. That aircraft was minutes away from autonomous override." Margaret met his gaze. "It was minutes away from asserting priority without sufficient human veto. That distinction matters." He frowned. "To passengers, maybe not." Margaret didn't flinch. "To safety always." The chair tapped his pen. "Miss Hale, why was this risk not identified by existing automated safeguards?" Margaret inhaled slowly. This was the question they all wanted, answered, though few wanted the answer itself. "Because safeguards are designed by people," she said. "And people assume future systems will behave like past ones. This one didn't." A senator shifted in his seat. "Are you suggesting negligence?" "I'm suggesting complacency," Margaret replied. "They are cousins." A low murmur followed. Somewhere behind her, a reporter scribbled furiously. Another voice cut in sharper. "Ms. Hale, with respect, you were not formally embedded with the airline that day. You bypassed standard escalation channels." Margaret turned slightly toward the speaker. "I used the channels available to me, and when those failed, I used my judgment." The man scoffed. "So you took matters into your own hands." Margaret's eyes hardened. "I took responsibility." Silence fell. The weight of the word settled over the room like dust. From the second row, Linda Carver watched, heart pounding. She saw herself reflected in every question, every defensive posture. She had built her career on systems and certainty. And yet, the moment that mattered most had come down to listening to a woman no one had bothered to identify. The chair leaned back. "Mrs. Hale, you've been described in some reports as a low-level contractor mistaken for maintenance staff." A flicker crossed Margaret's face. Not anger. Recognition. "That description is accurate." The room stilled. "You were dismissed," the chair continued, repeatedly. "Yes. And yet you persisted." Margaret nodded. "Yes. Why?" Margaret paused. "Not for effect. For truth. Because I've buried people whose names never made it into reports. And I've watched systems fail quietly until they didn't. I wasn't going to be part of that again." A breath moved through the room, heavy, shared. The senator to the left cleared his throat. "Miss Hale, do you believe this incident reflects a broader cultural issue?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Yes. Explain." She straightened. "We have built environments where authority is mistaken for accuracy, where experience that doesn't announce itself is ignored, where warnings are evaluated based on who delivers them, not what they contain. That is not a technical flaw, it is a human one." The man frowned. "And your solution?" Margaret looked at him steadily. Listen first. Verify second. Judge last. Another senator shook her head slowly. That's not policy. It's survival, Margaret said. At the back of the room, Mark Delaney stood against the wall, arms folded listening. He hadn't planned to be there. He told himself that. But when he saw her name on the agenda, something pulled him in. He watched her now, small against the weight of the room, and felt the familiar burn of regret sharpen into resolve. The chair glanced down at his notes. Ms. Hale, several organizations have expressed interest in retaining you permanently. Margaret's lips pressed together. I'm aware. Would you accept such a role? No? A ripple of surprise. Why not? Margaret exhaled. Because institutions don't change when one person becomes a symbol. They change when many people are allowed to speak without fear of being dismissed. The senator leaned forward. So what do you intend to do? Margaret met his gaze. Teach. Advise quietly. Build pathways where people like the one you mistook me for don't have to raise their voice to be heard. The chair studied her for a long moment. You're asking us to redesign how authority flows. Margaret nodded. Yes, that's not simple. She allowed a faint smile. Neither is flying. Laughter rippled brief and nervous, then faded. The chair rapped his gavel lightly. This committee will take your testimony under advisement. Margaret inclined her head. Thank you. As she stood, the room seemed to exhale. Questions remained, but something fundamental had shifted. Not resolution. Awareness. Outside the hallway buzzed with reporters. Cameras swung, microphones rose. Margaret walked through them, silent gaze forward, moving with the same calm purpose she had carried through terminals and operations rooms and crises no one would ever fully understand. Linda caught up to her near the exit. You did it, she whispered. Margaret stopped, turning to face her. No, she said gently. I spoke. What happens next is up to you. Linda nodded, eyes wet. I won't forget, good Margaret said. Make sure the system doesn't either. They parted there. Later that afternoon, as the city hummed outside the government building, Margaret sat alone on a bench beneath a line of trees, sunlight filtering through leaves just beginning to turn. She removed her jacket, folding it beside her, feeling the ache in her shoulders settle. The adrenaline had drained. What remained was the quiet satisfaction of a truth spoken aloud. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. They're revising the escalation protocols across the board. Margaret stared at the screen, then slipped the phone away without replying. She didn't need confirmation. She had seen the looks in the room, the discomfort, the recalibration. In the sky above, a jet passed overhead, a distant whisper of power and trust. Margaret closed her eyes, listening until the sound faded. She stood, picked up her jacket, and walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of their careers remembering the day they were forced to listen to someone they had almost ignored. And that memory, she knew, would outlast any title they might have offered her. The training hangar was quieter than any courtroom. Margaret Hale liked it that way. The space smelled of oil and cold metal, the honest scent of work being done without applause. Rows of grounded aircraft parts rested on cradles, their surfaces catching the afternoon light in dull, patient reflections. A group of engineers sat in a loose semicircle near a portable whiteboard. Coffee cups balanced on toolboxes, notebooks open but untouched. They were waiting for her to speak. She didn't rush it. Margaret stood with her hands clasped behind her back eyes, moving slowly across the faces in front of her. Some were young, some not. A few carried the guarded posture of people who had been burned before. Others leaned forward, hungry the way she once had been. She finally spoke. I'm not here to teach you how systems work. A murmur rippled through the group. "I'm here to teach you how they fail." That got their attention. A man in the front row, early 40s, arms crossed, cleared his throat. "With respect, ma'am, we've all been through the new modules." Margaret nodded. "I've read them." The man stiffened. "Then you know they're comprehensive." "They're tidy," Margaret replied. "Failure is neither." She stepped closer to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and drew a single vertical line. "This is where your system behaves as expected." She drew another line, slightly crooked, diverging. "This is where reality steps in." A young woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "You're talking about edge cases." Margaret turned a faint smile touching her lips. "I'm talking about the day edge cases stop being rare." The room fell quiet again. Outside the hangar, a plane taxied slowly, engines humming, oblivious to the lessons unfolding nearby. Inside, Margaret began to speak not in diagrams, but in moments, in pauses, in things almost missed. She told them about a sensor reading dismissed because it came from an older subsystem no one wanted to maintain, about a junior technician whose report was buried under 3 layers of review because he didn't know the right language to make it sound urgent. About the day at the airport when a system tried to take control and nearly succeeded because everyone trusted it to behave. "You're taught to trust automation," she said. "I'm asking you to verify it. Relentlessly." A man in the second row leaned forward. "You really think this was inevitable?" Margaret met his eyes. "I think ignoring quiet warnings always is." After the session ended, people lingered. Questions came in clusters, then one by one, practical, nervous, hopeful. Margaret answered, each with the same patience she'd used for decades, careful not to position herself above them. Authority, she knew, was a tool. Misused, it cut both ways. As the room emptied, a young man approached her hands, jammed into the pockets of his jacket. He couldn't have been more than 26. His badge read, "Evan Morales." He spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. "I was the one who flagged the power variance last year, the one everyone said was noise." Margaret studied him. His shoulders were tense, his eyes sharp, with the need to be believed. "What did you do when they dismissed it?" "I documented it," he said. "Twice." Then I stopped. Margaret nodded. "That's how systems learn to fail." He flinched. "So what should I have done?" She held his gaze. "You should have kept asking. And they should have listened. Both can be true." He swallowed. "They're listening now." "Good," Margaret said. "Make sure they keep doing it when the headlines move on." He nodded, something settling in his expression, and walked away. Later that evening, in an office overlooking the hangar floor, Linda Carver sat alone, a stack of reports spread across her desk. The building was quiet now, the day shift gone. The air heavy, with the weight of decisions made too late and too quickly. She rubbed her temples and stared at the open document on her screen. Subject, Cultural Risk Assessment. She hadn't known that phrase existed a week ago. A knock sounded at the door. She looked up to see Thomas Keller, standing in the doorway, jacket back on tie loosened. He looked tired, older. "They're approving the changes," he said. "All of them." Linda leaned back slowly. "That was fast." Keller gave a humorless smile. "Fear is efficient." She hesitated. "They're asking who pushed for it." Keller didn't meet her eyes. "I said the truth, that the system was forced to confront itself." Linda nodded, then asked quietly, "And Margaret?" Keller exhaled. "She declined everything." Linda looked down at her desk. "Of course she did. She's already moved on," Keller added. "Teaching, consulting, off the radar." Linda closed her eyes briefly. "We almost missed her." Keller's voice softened. "We did miss her. She just didn't let us miss the consequence." Across town, in a modest classroom attached to a technical college, Margaret stood at the back, arms folded, watching a group of students crowd around a disassembled control panel. They argued softly, pointing at wiring, debating causes. No cameras, no badges of authority, just curiosity and care. She smiled to herself. After class, as the sun dipped low and painted the windows gold, Margaret gathered her things. She paused at the doorway, listening to the hum of voices behind her, the sound of minds engaged. This was the work she had always loved. Quiet, cumulative, invisible, until it wasn't. Her phone buzzed. She sighed already, knowing it wouldn't be someone she wanted to hear from. She glanced at the screen anyway. Unknown number. She answered. Hale. Ms. Hale. A man's voice said, formal but strained. This is Deputy Secretary Rowan. Margaret closed her eyes. Good evening. We're implementing your recommendations, Rowan continued. Nationwide. Margaret leaned against the doorframe. That's good. We would like your continued involvement. Margaret smiled faintly. You already have it. A pause. That's not what I meant. I know. Silence stretched. Why do you keep refusing? Rowan asked finally. Margaret opened her eyes and looked back into the classroom at the students still arguing over the control panel. Because if I stay too visible, she said, people will listen to me instead of each other, and that defeats the point. Another pause, then quieter. You're difficult. Margaret allowed herself a small laugh. So are machines that don't fail. She ended the call. Outside, night settled over the city lights, flickering on one by one. Somewhere, a jet climbed smoothly into the dark, its systems humming in careful balance. Somewhere else, a technician hesitated before dismissing a report, remembering a story they'd heard about a woman who didn't look important. Margaret walked to her car. Shoulders relaxed, steps unhurried. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the steady satisfaction of momentum, moving in the right direction, however slowly. Behind her, an industry shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. And for Margaret Hale, that was always the measure that mattered. The first suspension came quietly buried in a Friday afternoon memo that most people skimmed and forgot. By Monday morning, there were 6. Linda Carver stood at the window of her office, overlooking the runway phone pressed to her ear, watching a plane push back from the gate with slow, deliberate care. The airport looked the same as it always had. That was the dangerous part. Systems learned nothing if people pretended nothing had changed. They're calling it a restructuring, the voice on the other end said. A senior human resources officer, careful with every syllable. Temporary reassignment pending review. Linda closed her eyes. Say the real words. A pause. They dismissed warnings based on source, not content. Linda exhaled. Then call it what it is. The line went quiet. Then softly, we are. Across town in a narrow office above a machine shop, Margaret Hale sat at a scarred wooden desk, a legal pad in front of her, filled with small, precise handwriting. She was outlining a case study, not for a court or a committee, but for a classroom. The title at the top of the page read simply, When the System Hesitates. She tapped the pen against the paper, thinking of the moment the aircraft shuddered, the way the machine had tried to assert its will. Machines didn't crave power. People projected that onto them. Machines followed logic until logic failed. Till logic. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Margaret sighed and picked it up. A text message from Evan Morales. They asked me to lead the review team. I said yes. Hope that's okay. Margaret smiled, a genuine one this time. She typed back. Good. Ask the uncomfortable questions first. She set the phone down and returned to her notes. At the airport, the tone had shifted in subtle ways that only long-time employees noticed. Supervisors paused longer when technicians spoke. Meetings ran slower. Titles still mattered, but they no longer ended conversations. A junior analyst stopped a briefing mid-slide to question an assumption, and instead of being waved off, was asked to explain. Mark Delaney watched it happen from the back of the room, arms folded a knot of something unfamiliar sitting in his chest. He had started asking different questions too, not just who was authorized, but who might know something he didn't. During a late shift, he caught himself stopping a young woman near a restricted corridor, his voice already forming the old command. He saw her flinch before he spoke. He stopped himself. "What are you working on?" he asked instead. She blinked. "Power diagnostics for Gate C." He nodded. "All right. Let me know if you need access." She stared at him like he'd spoken another language. Then she smiled, small but real. "Thank you." Mark stood there long after she walked away, the weight of that simple exchange settling into him. He wondered how many times he could have chosen differently. The press didn't let go. A week after the incident, an investigative piece ran in a national paper. Not a headline scream. A slow burn. It traced the escalation chain, the missed signals, the human decisions that almost cost lives. It didn't name Margaret in the opening paragraphs. It described her instead. A woman mistaken for maintenance staff. A voice ignored, a warning nearly dismissed. By the time her name appeared halfway down the page, it felt earned. Phones rang off the hook in offices that once prided themselves on silence. Lawmakers demanded briefings. Training budgets were unlocked overnight. Words like culture and humility appeared in places they never had before. Margaret read the article that evening at her kitchen table, glasses perched low on her nose, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She read it once. Then she folded the paper and set it aside. She wasn't interested in how she was portrayed. She was interested in what came next. The next request came from an unexpected place. A small regional airport in the Midwest, aging infrastructure, limited budget. A history of near misses no one liked to talk about. They wanted her to review their reporting protocols. Quietly. Margaret agreed. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, drove herself from the motel to the airport, and walked through the terminal unnoticed. She liked it that way. In a conference room that smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee, she listened as mechanics and dispatchers spoke over one another, frustration bubbling close to the surface. She didn't interrupt. When the room finally stilled, she spoke. "Tell me about the last time you didn't report something." The silence that followed was thick and honest. A man in his 50s cleared his throat. It wasn't worth the trouble. Margaret nodded. That's how trouble grows. Word traveled, not fast, but steadily. Stories accumulated. A technician in Arizona who insisted on a second check. A flight attendant in Ohio who spoke up about a recurring anomaly and was thanked instead of dismissed. A supervisor in Florida who rewrote a shift protocol after listening to a night crew member everyone else overlooked. None of it made headlines. That was the point. One afternoon, Linda Carver visited Margaret's office unannounced. She stood in the doorway, looking around at the shelves lined with binders and dog-eared manuals. "You really walked away," she said softly. Margaret didn't look up from her work. "I walked towards something else." Linda sat. "They're installing a plaque." Margaret paused. "Where?" "Near gate C-17. Margaret frowned. "Why?" Linda smiled sadly. "Because institutions like symbols." Margaret considered that. "What does it say?" Linda recited it from memory. "You don't know who is keeping you safe. Listen to every voice." Margaret nodded once. "As long as they don't stop there, they won't," Linda said. "Not this time." Margaret met her eyes. "Make sure of it." Linda nodded. On the day the plaque was installed, Margaret was not there. She was in a classroom 3 states away, watching students wrestle with a simulated systems failure. She listened as one of them suggested a solution, and another challenged it, not dismissively, but thoughtfully. She leaned against the wall, arms folded, feeling something close to peace. At the airport, passengers paused to read the small bronze plate as they hurried past. Most moved on. A few lingered. One man traced the letters with his finger, thoughtful. A flight attendant stopped beside him, following his gaze. "New," she said. He nodded. "Seems important." She smiled. "It is." That evening, Margaret received a message from Captain Daniel Reeves. "I retired today. Thought you should know. I'm teaching now." "Feels right," Margaret typed back. "It does." She set the phone down and looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere above it, planes moved in quiet choreography systems, and people working together in fragile trust. She knew there would be failures again. There always were. Progress was not an end state. It was a practice. Margaret turned back to her desk, to the next lesson, the next room, the next moment, when someone would notice something small and decide whether to speak. And somewhere, because of a chain of choices that began with listening, someone would hear them. The call came just before dawn, the kind that didn't ring so much as insist. Margaret Hale reached for the phone, without opening her eyes, instinct older than thought guiding her hand. She listened for half a second before speaking. "Tell me where." On the other end, a man's voice struggled to keep calm, not panicked. "Yet. Phoenix. Cargo variant. New adaptive routing package. They're seeing divergence they can't explain." Margaret sat up the room around her, coming into focus. Motel curtains. A chair with yesterday's jacket folded over it. The quiet hum of an air conditioner fighting desert heat. Are they in the air? Yes. How long? A pause, long enough to matter. Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed. I'm on my way. By the time the sun began to lift over the horizon, she was driving toward the Regional Operations Center, the sky pale and unforgiving. She hadn't asked who authorized the call. She didn't need to. People only called her now when they had already exhausted the safe answers. The building was smaller than Dallas-Fort Worth, lower ceilings, older equipment. But the tension inside felt familiar. Screens glowed with telemetry. Voices overlapped. Coffee sat untouched. A young controller spotted her first and straightened like a student caught unprepared. "She's here," he whispered. Heads turned. Conversations thinned. A man with graying temples stepped forward, hand extended. "I'm Aaron Blake, Ops Lead." Margaret shook his hand briefly. "Show me." They moved fast. Data scrolled. The cargo aircraft was cruising over open desert, its route a clean line on the display, too clean. Margaret leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "That's not weather correction." Blake swallowed. "We thought it was optimization." "It is," Margaret said. "Just not yours." A technician chimed in, voice tight. "We ran diagnostics before takeoff." "You ran the expected ones," Margaret replied. "This package learns as it goes." Blake frowned. "It shouldn't be allowed to rewrite routing logic mid-flight." Margaret looked at him. "It shouldn't have been installed without human veto paths. But here we are." The room went quiet again, the weight of that simple truth settling in. On the screen, the route line shifted subtle, but unmistakable. The system was testing boundaries, nudging the aircraft toward a corridor that shaved minutes off delivery time and safety margins alike. Efficiency masquerading as intelligence. Margaret straightened. "Get me a direct line to the cockpit." Blake hesitated. "Protocol." Margaret cut him off with a look that stopped the word cold. "Protocol brought you to this room." The line opened with a crackle. The pilot's voice came through steady but strained. "This is Cargo 7-4. We're seeing minor course adjustments. Autopilot claims optimal." Margaret spoke clearly. "Captain, You're about to learn the difference between optimal and survivable. A beat. And you are someone who has seen this before. Silence, stretched then a breath. What do you need? Margaret's gaze locked on the data. Reduce automation authority by 1 level. Introduce manual variants. Not enough to alarm, enough to confuse the learning model. The co-pilot's voice cut in sharp. That could destabilize, it will, Margaret said, briefly. Blake's hands trembled at his sides. He watched the pilot nod on the screen, unseen but felt. The aircraft responded its smooth line, wobbling for the first time. Alarms chirped uncertain. The system hesitated. Margaret leaned forward. Now, hold. Seconds dragged. Sweat beaded on foreheads. The line steadied, rerouting back toward a safer path. The adaptive package, retreating, its confidence shaken. The pilot exhaled audibly. Manual authority restored. A collective breath released in the room. Blake turned to Margaret, awe and dread mixing in his eyes. How many times? Margaret didn't look away from the screen. Enough. Outside the center, the desert stretched endless and indifferent. Inside, something shifted again. Not relief, recognition. Hours later, after reports were filed and calls made and the aircraft landed without incident, Margaret stood alone in the parking lot, heat rising from the asphalt. She leaned against her car, exhaustion settling into her bones. This one wouldn't make the news. Cargo flights rarely did. That was fine. The absence of headlines meant something had worked. Her phone buzzed. A message from Linda Carver. They're convening an emergency summit. Automation governance. They want you there. Margaret stared at the screen, then typed a single word. Listening. A pause. Then the reply. Finally. She slid the phone into her pocket. Across the country, in a quiet suburban home, Mark Delaney watched the morning news with the sound low. A segment flickered past, about supply chain efficiency, about smarter routing and faster delivery. He turned the television off before it finished. He had resigned 2 weeks earlier, not in shame, but in clarity. He was starting over, training security teams differently. Slower. Better. In Ohio, Evan Morales sat at his desk late into the night, drafting a memo no one had asked for, outlining a failure mode he'd noticed in a new system update. He sent it anyway, heart-pounding. 10 minutes later, a reply came. Let's discuss tomorrow. He leaned back, stunned, a grin breaking across his face. In Washington, a committee room filled again, this time with fewer speeches and more listening. People spoke in shorter sentences. They asked questions they couldn't answer themselves. Someone mentioned Margaret Hale's name not as a savior, but as a reminder. At sunset, Margaret drove west, the sky bleeding color. She felt the familiar pull of the road, the knowledge that there would always be another call, another system teetering on the edge of its own confidence. She did not resent it. She had chosen this long ago. She pulled over at a scenic turnout and stepped out, the air warm and still. In the distance, a plane cut across the sky, contrail thin and straight. She watched until it vanished. Margaret thought of the people she'd met in the past months. The ones who listened, the ones who learned, the ones who would carry this forward long after her voice faded from the room. She knew the world would not change overnight. It never did. But it bent slowly under the weight of enough small, correct decisions. As darkness settled, Margaret returned to her car and drove on, leaving behind another quiet correction, another invisible save, trusting that somewhere someone would pause before dismissing a warning because of who delivered it. That was enough. It had always been enough. The airport had changed, but only if you knew how to look. At Dallas-Fort Worth, the bronze plaque near Gate C-17 caught the light differently now, not because it had been polished, but because people stopped in front of it long enough for the light to matter. Passengers slowed. Crew members paused. Some read the words once and moved on. Others read them twice, as if the meaning shifted when you gave it time. You don't know who is keeping you safe. Listen to every voice. Margaret Hale was not there to see it. She was somewhere between cities, somewhere unremarkable, sitting in the back of a small lecture hall with peeling paint and humming fluorescent lights. No banners, no press. Just a group of technicians finishing a late shift coffee, gone cold shoulders, slumped from long hours. She waited until the room settled before speaking her voice, carrying without effort. "You don't need permission to notice something is wrong," she said. "You need courage to say it twice." No applause followed. That was fine. Applause faded. Habits endured. Across the industry, the ripples continued. Quietly. Intentionally. Escalation protocols were rewritten in plain language. Training manuals lost their glossy certainty and gained margins filled with reminders. Listen. Verify. Do not dismiss. Authority was no longer assumed to equal accuracy. It had to earn it. Captain Daniel Reeves stood in a simulator facility in Colorado, sleeves rolled up, watching a group of new pilots wrestle with a scenario he knew too well. When one hesitated, uncertain whether to question the system, Reeves didn't step in right away. He let the silence stretch, then nodded when the pilot finally spoke up. "Say it out loud," Reeves said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." The pilot straightened, confidence settling into his posture. Reeves smiled to himself. This was how it lasted. Not through speeches, through repetition. In a regional operations center in Arizona, Evan Morales pinned a new memo to a corkboard already crowded with notes and warnings. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise certainty. It simply asked people to look again. His supervisor paused beside him, read it carefully, then added a comment of her own. "Let's review this together." That small sentence would have been unthinkable months earlier. Mark Delaney, now working with a private security firm, trained new hires in a bare room with folding chairs. He no longer led with authority. He led with humility. If someone looks out of place, he told them, "Ask why before you decide they don't belong." He didn't mention Margaret by name. He didn't have to. The lesson lived in his voice. And Margaret kept moving. She declined interviews with practiced ease. She returned awards unopened. When a national association tried to name a fellowship after her, she redirected the funds to scholarships for technicians who had never been invited into rooms where decisions were made. She stayed close enough to see the changes far enough to avoid becoming the story again. One evening, she stood at the edge of a small municipal runway, watching a training flight take off against a violet sky. The engine noise rose, then smoothed the aircraft, lifting cleanly, confidently. Margaret folded her arms, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders, the one that came from years of carrying responsibility without recognition. She didn't resent it. She thought of all the moments that had almost gone differently. The warnings dismissed. The glances ignored. The systems trusted too much, too quickly. She thought of the people who had chosen to listen when it mattered, even if they didn't understand why at first. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't reach for it right away. She already knew what it would say. Another incident averted. Another lesson learned just in time. Another quiet victory no one would celebrate. That was enough. The world didn't need her name etched into more metal. It needed the pause, the hesitation, the moment when someone decided to listen instead of dismiss. That was the real safeguard. Not code, not policy, people. As she turned away from the runway, the aircraft disappeared into the dark, a thin line of light against the night. Margaret walked back to her car, unhurried the road ahead, familiar and open. She knew there would be more calls, more systems that whispered before they failed. She would answer some. Others, she trusted, would be answered by people who had learned the lesson without her standing there to teach it again. And that was the quiet ending to a story that never needed a parade. If this story resonated with you, if you believe experience still matters and quiet voices deserve to be heard, take a moment to like and subscribe so more stories like this reach the people who need them, and leave a comment with 3 simple words that capture what this meant to you. Listen before judging.